Mira Dalton had finally drifted off to sleep atop my chest when my phone vibrated on the nightstand. I carefully adjusted my position, making sure I didn't disturb her. The display glowed with a text from my mother, Sandra Quinwell. I braced myself for something generic and performative. Perhaps a suggestion about formula or a link to an article about Italian parenting she wanted me to read. Yet instead, the message was 6 words that shattered my life. "We're moving to Florence." I emptied the account. "Good luck." I stayed frozen, not moving for a full minute. My limbs went cold with shock before my mind could process any of it. I launched the banking app and just stared at the numbers in the joint family fund. 0 was all that remained. This was the same fund we had each paid into, Sandra Quinwell, Talbot Quinwell, and myself, for emergencies, mutual support, and Bryony Quinwell's recovery. They withdrew every last penny, not even leaving a forwarding contact or so much as a postscript. My breathing caught, short and tight. Mira shifted, her small hand curling beside my collarbone. Her body radiated warmth, filled with trust, entirely oblivious to the fact that 2 individuals she would never remember had just made a choice that would determine her whole future. I pressed a kiss to her brow and murmured, "Appreciate the warning." They hadn't even bothered to let the 10 days finish. I had been left in charge of her while Bryony Quinwell recuperated after her alleged collapse in Lisbon. Nobody explained how long this arrangement would last, or warned me that it would involve disappearing acts and financial sabotage. But honestly, nothing involving them ever came with straightforward instructions. I lowered Mira carefully into the travel bassinet, listening to her even breathing. After that, I rose and headed toward the kitchen, where I stashed my hard copies, documents my mother, Sandra Quinwell, always teased me about printing. I retrieved the latest statement from the bank. It revealed over $5,500 4 weeks ago. I naturally tried reaching out to them, but my calls went straight to voicemail. I sent a message to Bryony Quinwell, but received no response. There was a weight in my chest. Not panic, but something even more substantial. A recognition. Of course, they would act this way. It made sense that I would be the one left behind, taking care of the child, managing the debt, and dealing with the silence. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind me as I rested against the countertop and surveyed the kitchen. Bottles, diapers, and her rosy sleep sack, still radiating warmth in the laundry hamper. Everything that had once belonged to someone else was suddenly my responsibility, simply because no one else would claim it. By morning, I would start sifting through Mira Dalton's routine and try to figure out how to begin the legal guardianship process. But for the moment, I just sat next to her, watching her sleep, feeling the sheer weight of everything, the pressure pushing at my ribs, because in my heart I had already accepted they had left for good. Not for Mira, and certainly not for me. The truth is, there was no reason I should have been caught off guard. Being the dependable one creeps in so silently, I hardly notice the constraints taking shape. It's being the one to pick up Bryony Quinwell from dance class, because Sandra Quinwell is swamped with deadlines, even though I had a club to attend. It's handling my father's laundry since my sibling Bryony gets sidetracked, and watching as their lost focus ends up garnering them praise. I always believed that offering my help actually mattered. I thought being counted on was what gave me worth, but reliability ended up making me vanish. Bryony Quinwell brought chaos, high emotions and dramatic scenes in parking lots. She would scrawl poetry on napkins and drift through a dozen unfinished college pursuits before finally choosing spiritual anthropology. Everyone seemed to adore her for being so dazzlingly flawed and irresponsibly bright. My parents cherished my sister as if she were delicate glass, even as she broke everything around her. As for me, I was simply the sturdy support. They described the family reserve as a collective safety net. The pool came from my mother's extra jobs, my father's speaking honorariums, and what I made from freelance work. It all kicked off following my sibling Bryony Quinwell's second stint in the hospital. I stayed behind just in case another person might require assistance. I recall that precise wording, someone else. Not Bryony. Not again. Someone different. Yet, I never counted as someone different. I was always the contingency plan. The first time Bryony withdrew all the funds, it was to attend a retreat in the Adirondacks. She described it as life-changing. On the second occasion, the money went toward an unsuccessful relocation to Eugene for a memoir that never materialized. Everyone insisted I shouldn't be so inflexible about finances, insisting Bryony was simply discovering who she was meant to be. All the while, I was covering lapses in my auto insurance and went without new glasses for 3 years. So here I found myself. They had abandoned me with her daughter, emptied the account, and departed for Florence as if it were a long-delayed break. The absence that followed that message wasn't just unkindness. It was unmistakable understanding. Returning was never part of their plan. Not to offer support, not to respond, not even to check. I sat on the couch, the room cast in shadow, while Mira Dalton murmured softly in her sleep. My mind drifted to the last time my mother had visited this apartment. She scowled at my chipped mug and remarked, "You still haven't gotten dishes that match." She chose not to acknowledge the handcrafted tiles I'd put into the bathroom or the vintage photographs I'd refurbished for the Historical Society. It was simply the dishes I noticed. Naturally, I walked out without a farewell. That was just how I had always been. That was true of all of us. I was always the reserved child, the dependable one. And dependable children apparently don't deserve a heads up. Yet Mira would. She was going to require far more than what my parents had ever offered. And it fell to me alone to figure out how to provide that. By the 4th day, my body had adapted to operate in 3-hour fragments. Mira's sleeping habits were like trying to solve an erratic equation. Sometimes 4 naps of 55 minutes each, other times a single, longer stretch punctuated by a cry from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. Her voice never failed to amaze me with its force. My nerves were raw and overstressed. I managed to squeeze in work editing footnotes for a local history journal in brief bursts, while she slept on a folded towel next to my computer. The client reached out to me twice regarding the timeline. I fabricated a story about a family crisis causing delays, which felt like a laughable understatement. Every feeding required careful bargaining. Every change was a flurry of motion. I walked her around until my arms were sore, then swayed with her as I listened to podcasts through my headphones, trying to keep myself from nodding off. Occasionally there were tiny moments when she would grin at me, all gums, and those moments felt as vital as breathing. Just as quickly, she would shriek again, and I would sense myself dissolving into the background. A few friends sent their regards, some messages, a meme now and then. No one ever actually came by. I phoned Bryony twice, leaving a single voicemail. I even wrote out a third message to her, asking for her take, but uncertain about when she would return, I didn't end up sending it. I figured there really wasn't a reason to do so. On Friday morning, after a sleepless night spent pacing the apartment with Mira Dalton bundled against my chest as she cried onto my shoulder, I opened the front door for the mail and found a small, still-warm Tupperware container left on the doorstep. There was a note penned in tiny cursive, "You're doing more than enough." When I glanced across the hallway, I noticed Mrs. Arl's curtains give a faint twitch. She was retired, lived alone, and enjoyed reading mystery novels with her windows open. Previously, the only conversation I'd ever had with her was a brief exchange about trash pickup. Later that same afternoon, she tapped softly on my door and handed me a neatly folded quilt. "I made it for the wrong-sized bed," she explained in a businesslike tone. I thanked her, and she didn't ask to come in. She left without lingering. That marked the first time in days that I felt truly seen by another person. That night, I sat bathed in the kitchen's warm light, cradling Mira Dalton in one arm while managing spoonfuls of leftover stew with the other. My limbs ached, and there was a weight in my chest that food couldn't ease. Still, for the first time in 10 days, I wasn't overcome by loneliness. On Friday morning, I searched for the old folder where my mother, Sandra Quinwell, and my father, Talbot Quinwell, stored our legal paperwork. I hadn't entered their house since the day they departed. The place still carried the scent of lemon wood polish and an unmistakable self-assurance. I tried convincing myself I'd only stop by to pick up the last bit of formula, or maybe to uncover a forgotten bassinet in the attic, though deep down I was seeking something else. Was it assurance or solid evidence that I needed? Mira Dalton dozed in the carrier pressed against my chest as I wandered the kitchen, opening drawers at a hesitant pace. The refrigerator was bare, save for a small jar of fancy imported fig. Jam and half a bottle of sparkling wine sat untouched, the kitchen cabinets scrubbed spotless in a way that felt too impersonal. Only someone who doesn't intend to come back leaves everything so empty. Rummaging through the bottom drawer beneath a heap of junk mail and a busted corkscrew, I discovered a frayed green folder marked Italy. Inside, I found printed travel plans spanning the past half a year. There were documents for flights, an apartment lease, and Florence International SIM cards that had already been activated. None of this was done on a whim. It wasn't a rash, feelings-driven decision. I had carefully arranged all of it in advance. Behind those travel plans, a notarized document was tucked away. My own information, my name, address, and signature copied from a previous lease, appeared there. I realized that legal authority over Mira Dalton, listed as being 8 years old, had been granted to me for an undefined period. I pressed my thumb against the page, struggling to grasp how serious this was. They had named me as her legal guardian without asking, without any discussion, without even pretending I had a choice. Tucked in the back of that folder was a printed statement from the bank. The family's account showed a transaction from 10 days before they disappeared. There was a withdrawal for $17,250. The funds were moved to Meridian Trust's private international division. This wasn't even a U.S.-based bank. They shifted the money out of the country. I sat at their kitchen table, where faculty dinners were once held, straightening my back and fixating on the figures. Anger should have erupted in me. I should have been ready to hurl something across the room. But what I actually experienced was a profound calm. This act wasn't an error. It represented an exchange. They picked their own freedom and used Mira Dalton as their justification. There was a pan resting on the counter, its price tag from a boutique in Eugene still attached. $190. That too was one more thing they'd abandoned. Carefully, I gathered up the paperwork and slipped it into my bag. Afterward, I surveyed the space one last time, half hoping to hear their voices drifting around the room. Yet the room remained silent, and the silence failed to comfort me. Once I got home, I stretched out, pulled open my laptop, and started looking up how to apply for emergency guardianship in Oregon. I figured the legal aid office would feel impersonal and overwhelmed. In many respects, I was right. The lobby was filled with the humming of harsh lights, and the receptionist hardly glanced up from her typing. Yet when Jonas Weller entered the space, his tie slightly askew and sleeves pushed up, he acknowledged me as a person, not just another file. That simple gesture nearly brought me to tears. I handed Jonas Weller the paperwork I had managed to collect. There was the power of attorney, a bank statement, and printed out travel plans. I watched as he carefully read each item, his fingers tapping the sheets before he finally responded. "They didn't contact you," he confirmed. I shook my head. No, they had simply disappeared. Jonas gave a short nod, his expression tense. That means it's about more than just guardianship being passed off. It might be considered financial abandonment, possibly even fraud, depending on how the money was categorized. He took the time to clarify that although the power of attorney may have been technically valid, the lies surrounding it were not. If I could demonstrate that they had tried to shirk their responsibilities without my approval, or had knowingly misappropriated joint funds, I would have justification to dispute both the guardianship and the finances. I asked Jonas Weller what the next steps would be. He told me it would be a slow and laborious uphill process. I replied that I had already spent countless nights without sleep for 10 days straight. One more struggle wouldn't faze me. Later that same day, I started gathering all possible evidence. I collected receipts, captured screenshots, pulled up Brian E. Quinwell's old texts requesting I cover for 3 days a week, and saved Sandra Quinwell's message about the funds. I organized the details into a spreadsheet, printing multiple versions and adding labels to each. It felt compulsive, yet I sensed I was carefully constructing something important, one document at a time. 4 days later, Bryony finally reached out by phone. I hesitated to take the call, but I wanted to capture her voice as proof. "Danica," she began, sounding cold and abrupt. "You agreed to this." "No, I did not. I promised I would pitch in for a single weekend. Not forever." There was nothing but silence from the other end, followed by a short, sharp laugh. It was brittle, patronizing. I have a tendency to exaggerate everything. I pressed record on my backup phone. "Is it your belief that they abandoned you? Grow up. They're finished with supporting you." I almost lost my grip on the phone. I kept my tone even. They weren't supporting me. They were using me as a shield. "You're absurd," she shot back. "This is over. You can't frighten us with legal warnings." I offered no reply. I let the silence remain between us. She ended the call. I saved the audio file and made 2 backups of it. Later that night, I came down with a mild fever. I cradled Mira Dalton to my chest, her breathing ragged and warm, and gazed up at the ceiling as the streetlight flickered against it. I didn't feel like I had any power. I wasn't triumphant, but the fear they held over me was gone. When morning came, I reached out to Jonas Weller and told him there was something important he needed to know. The message arrived on a Saturday morning while I was preparing a bottle. We flew back. I wanted to see for myself. There was no apology or clarification, just an announcement, as if they meant to pick up something they'd left behind. I decided not to respond. 4 days later, they arrived at my doorstep. My mother, Sandra Quinwell, wore an expensive scarf, and my father, Talbot Quinwell, had sunglasses balanced on his head as if it were a crown. They both seemed tanned and refreshed, a kind of relaxation only those without any obligations seemed able to achieve. I cracked the door just enough for their motives to reach the entryway, but go no further. "You look exhausted," my mother remarked, moving past me. "Still at that part-time job?" my father, Talbot, asked as he entered, arms folded and eyes already taking in the place. "We were surprised you didn't contact us sooner," he added. "We figured you'd have some questions, but I guess not everyone is made for this," they said, referring to parenting. I didn't respond. I just let them continue. My mother walked over to Mira, who was strapped in her high chair, gumming on some banana. She made a clucking sound of disapproval. "Her posture isn't right. You really ought to be doing tummy time more often." I faced them squarely. "I filed for full custody 4 weeks ago." They went silent. I included evidence of the wire transfers, the falsified power of attorney, and the fact that you neglected to inform me about plans to leave the country. I also possess recordings of conversations with Bryony Quinwell, where it's made clear I never consented to extended guardianship. Talbot Quinwell's jaw tensed. "Danica, escalation isn't necessary," Sandra Quinwell said, stepping closer. "Let's not turn this into a mess." "It's already a mess," I told them. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. They stayed silent for a while. My mother's face became steely, her eyes narrowing with that same icy calculation I'd become familiar with growing up. My father let out a sigh, putting on an air of dismay as though he'd rehearsed it countless times. He murmured, "I think it's best we go now." I gave a small nod in agreement and moved to open the door. My mother glanced back at me as she made her way outside. "You always did love theatrics. I just never thought you'd involve a child in it." I chose not to answer. I didn't show any reaction. Quietly, I closed the door, locked it, and finally let out a deep breath. Mira Dalton let her banana tumble onto the ground, then brought her hands together in applause. Later that day, Jonas Weller called to notify us that our court appearance had been rescheduled for an earlier date. Inside the courtroom, the scent of dust mingled with polished wood, and the lighting felt harsh and overwhelming. Jonas Weller moved with a subdued assurance, cradling our folder as though it were a sacred text. I stayed close to him, my hands clasped tightly as I kept my eyes trained on the judge instead of on my mother or my father. Sandra and Talbot made their entrance 15 minutes late. Bryony Quinwell never arrived. Jonas started by outlining the sequence of events. He submitted the notarized paperwork detailing our travel itinerary. Scheduled half a year ahead, the banking records showed the money had been siphoned off and sent overseas. After that, he revealed the audio files of Bryony's voice, cold and dismissive, making it clear I had never accepted guardianship. He presented the judge with a hard copy of the transcript. My mother, Sandra Quinwell, cleared her throat multiple times. My father, Talbot Quinwell, occasionally wore a smirk. They chose not to dispute the facts. Instead, they attempted to reinterpret them. "My daughter tends to embellish things," Sandra responded in a steady tone. "She's dealing with significant stress. Looking after a child, particularly one who isn't biologically hers, is understandably emotional." The judge remained impassive. "I have already examined the papers," she said, her tone even. "What troubles me isn't only the desertion, but the calculated way the money was moved. I was deceived and left with no help, neither financial nor emotional." She hesitated, then fixed her gaze on my parents. "I'm awarding complete legal custody to Danica Quinwell. The foreign bank account will be held until further examination. Any visits from my mother or father had to be pre-approved and supervised." My mother parted her lips to speak, but the judge signaled with an upraised palm, bringing everything to a close. Outdoors, the wind was stronger. Sandra Quinwell stopped me on the steps of the courthouse. "You were always envious of Bryony Quinwell," she muttered, her tone cold and urgent. "From childhood, you waited for an excuse to punish us because we loved her more." I stared at my mother, Sandra Quinwell, remaining silent. She spun on her heel, the click of her tall shoes echoing, trailing behind soundlessly. I made my way to the parking lot where Mira Dalton was waiting beside Mrs. Arles, who had shown up on her own. Mira laughed with delight at the sight of me, stretching her arms forward. That evening, while I soothed her to sleep in my arms, I realized that relief hadn't come. Just a strange, empty quietness, as if the tail end of a long echo remained. When I woke up the next morning, I checked my email. I noticed a message from Jonas Weller labeled as urgent. The kiln's low, gentle hum filled the space, giving off a quiet warmth. I usually keep it on that setting early most days, while Mira Dalton plays on her patchwork mat just a few feet from me. The cradle I crafted out of reclaimed pine boards rests next to a shelf lined with finished bowls. Sometimes, Mira naps in it, her little fingers gripping the cloth doll Mrs. Arles sewed entirely by hand. My hands are back in the clay again. The wheel is turning once more. I now open the studio 3 days a week, 4 if Mira is especially at ease. Commissions come in at a modest but regular pace. The Juniper mug refreshed their mug collection with my work recently. There's even a university student looking for a specially made set for her final show. I accept what I'm able to handle and let go of worries about the rest. Mrs. Arles drops by each Thursday with oatmeal cookies neatly bundled in wax paper. She never lingers, just makes sure I'm doing okay, and gives my hand a gentle squeeze. I hold out my arm before she slips away down the sidewalk. Her company offers a soothing calmness of its own, steady and reliable. Nothing like what the adults around me in my childhood were like. Occasionally, I still find myself waking up bracing for a new message, another unexpected twist in the ongoing ordeal. But it's been half a year now, and the quiet has become something manageable. Most of the legal details have been wrapped up. The account remains inaccessible. There's still been no contact from Bryony Quinwell. I've given up on anticipating anything. Recently, Mira Dalton managed her first steps from the work table to the door. She toppled after her fourth step, then giggled as if she was playing a trick. I couldn't help but giggle with her, and later, once she was asleep, I broke down in the kitchen, not from sadness, but because I was the only witness. Yesterday, I sent Bryony Quinwell a letter, not out of a sense of duty, but to bring some closure. I kept quiet for the most part. I simply wrote, "Mira Dalton is safe," and that was the most important thing I needed to say. I deliberately left out any details when I replied. Early today, as I unlocked the studio and pressed my hands into the moist clay, I glanced over at the little crib next to me. Inside was the miniature bowl indented by Mira Dalton's thumb, along with the light dusting of flour on the floor, the remnants of yesterday's attempt by an 8-year-old to bake. I ended up staying while the others left to find their own way out. Still, I chose to remain here and build a life for myself.